The pounding on my front door was so forceful, I half expected it to come crashing down. For a split second, my instincts flared, my body tensing the way it had during countless high-stakes operations. Old habits die hard. Years in the FBI, running counterintelligence, and busting organized crime, had wired me to recognize threats before they fully revealed themselves. But this was supposed to be my retirement. A quiet suburban neighborhood where the biggest problem should have been lawn maintenance, not someone banging on my door like they had a federal warrant. I took a slow breath, forcing myself to relax as I made my way across the living room, stepping around half-unpacked boxes and an untouched cup of coffee that was rapidly cooling. I had moved in less than a month ago. Still settling in. Still trying to convince myself that this life, barbecues, home improvement projects, neighborly small talk, was what I really wanted after decades in the field. But as I reached the door and caught a glimpse through the peephole, I felt that familiar sense of something being off. Two men stood on my porch, both in pressed navy blue polo shirts with the words, "Neighborhood Enforcement," stitched across the chest. Their matching gold emblems read the same. If I squinted, the badges almost looked legitimate, but I had spent too many years analyzing false credentials to be fooled. The shorter one, stocky with a thick mustache, held a clipboard tight against his chest like it was a firearm. The taller one, narrow-faced with wire-frame glasses, shifted on his feet like he wanted to be anywhere but here. Not exactly the type to exude authority. Still, I played along. I pulled open the door just enough to lean against the frame, keeping my expression neutral. "Can I help you?" The mustached one, clearly the talker, squared his shoulders. "We're from the HOA police, sir. We've received multiple complaints about your failure to comply with community yard maintenance standards. This is a formal warning." I barely stopped myself from laughing. A formal warning? The grass in my yard wasn't even 3 inches tall, and I hadn't received a single notice from the actual HOA since I moved in. But I didn't let my amusement show. Instead, I furrowed my brow, keeping my voice polite. "That's quite serious." The tall one nodded eagerly, as if encouraged by my reaction. "It is. And if you don't pay the fine immediately, we'll have no choice but to escalate enforcement." I tilted my head. "Fine?" The mustached man held out a carbon copy form with a bold $1,000 charge. "Cash payment is preferred, sir. No checks. No electronic transactions." And there it was. The first real crack in their ridiculous charade. I crossed my arms, pretending to consider it. That's a stiff fine. Especially for a yard that barely needs mowing. The taller one faltered, glancing toward his partner. The mustached man recovered quickly, puffing up his chest. "Rules are rules, sir. Failure to comply could result in further penalties, including suspension of neighborhood privileges." That was interesting. HOAs don't have the power to suspend anyone from anything. They issue fines, sure, but they don't run a dictatorship. And yet these guys were acting like they did. That's when I realized this wasn't about my yard. This was a test. I was new in town. Someone, Karen, probably, wanted to see if I was the type of guy who could be bullied, who would just hand over cash without asking questions. And that meant this wasn't just a one-time shakedown. If I didn't handle this right, it would keep escalating. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't have possibly guessed, was that they'd picked the worst possible target. I forced a sigh, rubbing the back of my neck. "All right. You two wait here. Let me grab my checkbook." The mustached man nodded, satisfied. "Good. We'll be right here." I stepped back inside, carefully closing the door behind me. Then I made my way to my home office, unlocked the filing cabinet, and pulled out my FBI badge. They had no idea what was coming next. I let the weight of my FBI badge settle in my palm for a moment, feeling the familiar coolness of the leather case between my fingers. I had pulled this out in situations far more intense than a couple of HOA con men, but the principle was the same: people who pretended to have authority crumbled the second they ran into someone who actually did. I slid the badge into my pocket, grabbed my phone, and switched on the camera. If these guys were dumb enough to demand a cash payment on tape, that would be all I needed to hand them over to local law enforcement. By the time I reopened the door, they were waiting impatiently, shifting on their feet like they had somewhere else to be. I could practically feel their nerves creeping in. They had tried this scam before, and they were used to people handing over the money just to make them go away. They weren't expecting pushback. "Apologies for the wait," I said, making my voice sound slightly unsure, like I was just another guy caught off guard by the HOA's ridiculous rules. I couldn't find my checkbook. Would it be possible to just do a quick online transfer? The mustached one, Frank DeLuca, visibly stiffened. The tall one, Darren, looked sideways at him, unsure how to answer. Frank was quick to recover. "Cash only. No checks. No online payments." That was the first real crack. HOAs accept checks. Some even have online portals. But scams? Scams thrive on untraceable money. I pretended to hesitate. "That's odd. I didn't know the HOA had such strict payment policies." Frank's patience thinned. "It's standard." He pushed the clipboard toward me, flipping to the last page where a signature line had been scribbled under the words HOA Compliance Acknowledgement. I took the form and glanced over it. It was a mess. Misspelled words. Inconsistent fonts. The formatting looked like it had been thrown together in Microsoft Word by a middle schooler. And the best part? A faint watermark that read "Sample Document" in the background. I didn't react, just hummed under my breath like I was seriously considering signing. Across the street, my neighbor, Curtis Harper, was still outside, casually watering his plants. But his gaze kept flicking toward my porch. He knew something wasn't right. Curtis was old school. The kind of guy who had lived in the neighborhood long enough to know that there was no such thing as an HOA police force. I made a mental note to check in with him later. He might have seen these guys running this scam before. "Tell you what," I said, tapping the clipboard against my palm. "Before I sign anything, I'd like to check the HOA handbook. Could you wait here while I grab it?" Darren shifted uneasily. Frank's jaw twitched. They didn't want me reading anything. "Sir, this isn't up for debate," Frank snapped, his voice sharper now. "You need to comply with HOA guidelines. Failure to do so could result in further penalties, including suspension of neighborhood privileges." There it was again. That bizarre phrasing. I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "And just out of curiosity, what exactly does suspension of neighborhood privileges mean?" Darren stayed silent. Frank pushed forward. "You'll lose access to community benefits," he bluffed. "Trash collection. Landscaping services. Even emergency response priority." I raised an eyebrow. "Emergency response priority? So, you're saying the HOA controls 911 dispatch?" Silence. Frank had overplayed his hand, and he knew it. Darren swallowed hard. Their scam was falling apart. I sighed, shaking my head. "All right, gentlemen. Here's the deal." I reached into my pocket, pulled out my FBI badge, and flipped it open. Frank and Darren froze. "You want to talk about rules? Here's one for you," I said, keeping my voice even. "Impersonating a law enforcement officer is a federal offense." Darren visibly paled. Frank clenched his jaw, fists curling at his sides. For a moment, I thought he might try to argue, until he realized that wasn't going to work. I continued, holding my phone up. "By the way, this conversation? Recorded. Including your little, cash-only, policy. So why don't we make this easy, and you two tell me exactly who sent you? Darren looked like he was about to crack, but Frank wasn't going down that easily. His eyes darted past me, scanning the street. And then, he lunged. He shoved me backward, knocking my phone from my hand. I caught my footing immediately, but by the time I stepped forward, they were already running. I heard Curtis shout from across the street. "Hey! What's going on? They're running a scam." I yelled back, already moving toward the sidewalk. Frank and Darren sprinted toward a battered old sedan parked at the end of the cul-de-sac. A woman, *** Monica Reyes, their getaway driver, was already behind the wheel, engine running. The two men scrambled into the car. Frank's foot caught on the curb, and his shoe flew off, landing in the middle of the street. A ridiculous detail, but one I wouldn't forget. The sedan lurched forward, tires screeching. They sped down the street, blowing through a stop sign, nearly clipping a neighbor's flower bed as they disappeared around the corner. I stood there, watching them go, heart still pounding. Then I turned to Curtis, who was already on his phone with 911. "I got the first 3 letters of the plate," I told him. "J4C. Curtis gave a low whistle. "Damn. You're not just some ex-military guy, are you?" I smirked but didn't answer. Let's just say, they picked the wrong house. I reached down, picked up Frank's abandoned shoe, and turned it over in my hand. They had tried to shake down the wrong man. And now? I was going to make sure they regretted it. The next morning, I walked outside to grab my newspaper, still mulling over the fake HOA cops from the day before. My FBI contacts were already digging into the partial plate number from their getaway car, and I had no doubt Frank, Darren, and Monica would resurface soon enough. But I wasn't expecting the new stunt that had been pulled overnight. My front yard was plastered with an "abandoned property" sign. Large, official-looking, printed in bold red letters. Right underneath, in smaller font, was a note that read, "Per HOA Policy Section 8B, failure to comply with community regulations may result in property forfeiture. This property has been designated for review." And there, at the bottom, was Karen Thompson's signature. I stared at the sign for a solid 5 seconds, jaw tightening. She was trying to steal my house. Across the street, Curtis Harper was already outside, shaking his head. "Saw them put that up last night. Karen and some of her cronies showed up with a couple of those clipboard-wielding enforcers around 2 a.m. Thought about calling you, but I figured you'd want to see it for yourself." I exhaled slowly, yanking the sign out of the ground. "Did they do this to anyone else?" Curtis scratched his head. "Not that I saw. Just you. Guess you're special." I already knew what this was. Retaliation. Karen had sent her 2 goons to test me, and when they failed, she decided to go bigger. I pulled out my phone, took a picture of the sign, then sent it straight to my FBI contact, Agent Calloway. "You're gonna want to look into this. Feels like a real estate scam on top of everything else." Not even a minute later, my phone rang. Calloway's voice was all business. "You're saying the HOA is trying to seize your house?" "Karen thinks she can bully people out of their homes," I said flatly. "She's either running a scam, or she's insane enough to believe she has that kind of power." "Wouldn't be the first time," Calloway muttered. "We've been tracking a pattern of fraudulent HOA evictions in multiple states. Same tactics, phony violations, fake liens, property forfeiture threats. Homeowners get scared, sell at a loss, and then the HOA handpicks new residents who follow the rules." I shook my head. "That's exactly what's happening here. Karen thinks she runs this place like a dictator." Calloway exhaled. "You need evidence?" "Because I can make some calls." I smirked. "Oh, don't worry. She's about to hand me all the evidence I need. And right on cue, a silver golf cart came zipping down the street. Karen. She pulled up in front of my driveway, stepping out like she was some kind of government official on an inspection. "Good morning, Mr. Lawson," she said, voice dripping with fake politeness. "I see you've received the notice." I folded my arms, raising an eyebrow. "Notice? You mean the fraudulent claim that my house is abandoned?" Karen gave a tight-lipped smile. "Per HOA policy." "Stop," I interrupted. "There is no HOA policy that lets you take someone's home. That sign is illegal." Karen's expression didn't even falter. "You signed an agreement when you moved here. Section 8B allows the HOA to review properties that fail to meet neighborhood standards. And since you refuse to comply with HOA enforcement, we're escalating to the next phase." I let out a sharp laugh. "So let me get this straight. First, you send two guys in fake uniforms to intimidate me. Then, when that doesn't work, you try to illegally claim my house as abandoned?" Karen barely blinked. "It's nothing personal. Rules are rules." "Oh, it's personal," I shot back. "Especially when you sent two criminals to shake me down for cash." That got her. Her eyes flashed with panic, just for a second, before she quickly smoothed it over. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "Don't worry," I said. "The police will be very interested in finding out." Karen's smugness flickered. But before she could respond, a black and white squad car turned the corner, rolling slowly down the street. Curtis gave a low whistle. "Now this should be fun." Karen turned her head, her composure finally cracking. "Hope you didn't call them for me," she said, forcing a laugh. "That would be a huge waste of their time." I smirked. "Oh no, that's your specialty." She glared at me. "Excuse me?" "You know, filing false police reports." And that's when she lost it. Karen's face turned red, her composure snapping like a brittle twig. "I did what was necessary to protect this neighborhood from people like you. You don't belong here. You think you're special just because you used to carry a badge? You are nothing here." The words hung in the air. Slowly, I glanced over at Curtis. He gave me a look of complete satisfaction. The police car rolled to a stop. The officer inside, Detective Raul Alvarez, stepped out, adjusting his belt. Karen immediately switched back to fake innocence. "Oh. Officer. It's so good you're here. We need to discuss this man's failure to follow HOA guidelines." Alvarez held up a hand, cutting her off. "Actually, I'm here about you, Ms. Thompson." Karen's smile froze. "I've received multiple reports of fraudulent notices, intimidation, and possible real estate fraud tied to your leadership of the HOA," Alvarez continued, pulling out his notepad. "We'll need to have a conversation down at the station." Karen stumbled over her words. That's absurd. I've done nothing wrong. He's the problem." Alvarez didn't react. "If that's true, then I'm sure you won't mind answering a few questions." Karen's jaw clenched. She knew she was backed into a corner, but she wasn't ready to surrender. Not yet. I leaned against my truck, arms crossed. "See you around, Karen." Her glare could have burned a hole through solid steel. She climbed back into her golf cart, whipping the wheel so hard that it nearly tipped on two wheels as she sped away. Curtis let out a breath. "That woman is gonna snap before this is over." I nodded. "Yeah. And when she does? I'll be ready." I should have known Karen wouldn't back down. After Detective Alvarez confronted her, she disappeared for a full day, no snide remarks, no passive-aggressive letters, no clipboard-wielding cronies marching through the neighborhood. It was almost peaceful. But in my experience, when a cornered snake stops rattling, that's when it's most dangerous. The silence didn't last. Late that night, I stepped outside to lock up when I caught a flicker of movement near my truck. At first, I thought it was a stray cat, but then I saw a shadowy figure crouched near my rear tire. My instincts kicked in, and in one swift motion, I flipped on the floodlight. The figure jumped like a guilty teenager caught sneaking in after curfew. But this wasn't a kid. It was one of Karen's HOA enforcers, a man named Brad Holloway, caught red-handed, holding a wrench near my brake line. I was moving before he could think. "You wanna explain what the hell you're doing?" Brad stumbled back, eyes darting like a trapped animal. I was just, Karen sent me to," he stopped himself, realizing he had just given her up within 3 seconds. I took a slow step forward, my voice deadly calm. "Karen sent you to what, Brad?" He swallowed hard, looking like he wanted to bolt. "Nothing. Just, routine inspection." I let out a short laugh. "Routine inspection? On my brakes?" He flinched. He knew he was caught. I pulled out my phone and took a picture of him, the wrench, and the very clear evidence that he had been tampering with my vehicle. "Here's how this is going to go," I said, keeping my voice steady. "You're going to explain exactly what Karen told you to do. Because right now, this is attempted manslaughter." Brad looked like he was about to be sick. She said you were making trouble. Said you needed to learn a lesson." I swear, I didn't know she meant. I cut him off. "Get out of here, Brad. Before I change my mind and call the cops right now." He didn't need to be told twice. He ran. The next morning, I didn't go to the police. Not yet. I wanted Karen to think she had gotten away with it, to let her feel safe enough to keep making mistakes. But I wasn't the only one who was done playing nice. By noon, half the neighborhood was outside, comparing notes. Karen had sent eviction notices to at least 6 homeowners, all on suspiciously flimsy violations. A few elderly residents had received fraudulent overdue fines, threatening property liens if they didn't pay up. "She's trying to clear people out," Curtis muttered, arms crossed as we stood outside the Whitaker household, where yet another fake eviction notice had been taped to the door. "Wants the whole neighborhood to be full of people who kiss her ass." Mrs. Whitaker, a woman in her 70s with a walker, shook her head. "I've lived here 20 years. That woman can pry my house from my cold, dead hands." "Don't give her ideas," Curtis muttered. Word spread fast. By evening, the Real HOA board, led by Patricia Dawson, called an emergency meeting. Karen showed up smug, clipboard in hand, fully expecting to intimidate her way out of it. But what she walked into wasn't a meeting. It was a reckoning. The community center was packed. Over 40 residents, all of whom had been harassed, fined, or targeted by Karen's schemes, sat in tense silence as Patricia stood at the front of the room, hands gripping the edges of the podium. Karen was already annoyed. "Let's get this over with," she sighed. "We need to discuss how certain individuals have been stirring trouble. We're here to discuss you, Karen." Karen's smirk faltered. "Excuse me?" Patricia held up a thick folder and flipped it open. "We've received numerous complaints regarding fraudulent eviction notices, illegal fines, and unauthorized property violations. Several homeowners have provided documentation that you've been issuing fines without board approval." Karen crossed her arms. "I don't need board approval. I am the board." "No, Karen," Patricia shot back. "You were the board. Effective immediately, the HOA is voting to remove you from any leadership position." A wave of relief spread through the room. Karen stared, processing. Then she laughed. "You can't do that. We just did." Karen lost it. She slammed her clipboard onto the table. "You ungrateful, pathetic little people. I built this neighborhood. I made it what it is. You think you can just take it from me? Patricia was unmoved. You don't own this neighborhood, Karen. And if you'd like to challenge our decision, feel free to take it to court. That shut her up. Because she knew, if this went to court, all her financial fraud would come out. Karen's jaw clenched so hard I thought her teeth might crack. But instead of backing down, she did something even dumber. She picked up her phone and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Fine. If I'm out, then let's see how this neighborhood does without me. I still have plenty of power left." Then she stormed out. Curtis, standing beside me, muttered, "That sounded an awful lot like a threat." I nodded. Because it was. Karen wasn't done. Not by a long shot. And the next time she made a move, it wouldn't just be fraud. It would be criminal. Karen should have walked away. She should have packed up, sold her house, and left town quietly. But people like Karen don't know how to lose. Losing means admitting they were never as powerful as they thought. It means acknowledging that their control over others was always an illusion. And Karen? She wasn't about to accept that. So she did what desperate people always do. She doubled down. 2 days after the HOA vote removed her from power, I woke up to a series of frantic messages from neighbors. Curtis. Patricia. Half a dozen others. The same words kept popping up. Turn on the news. I grabbed my phone and pulled up the local broadcast. And there she was. Karen had organized a full-blown protest outside the county courthouse. A crowd of about 20 people, probably the only supporters she had left, stood behind her, waving signs with slogans like, "Stop the HOA Purge" and "Karen was right." The local news anchor spoke over the footage. Former HOA President Karen Thompson is leading a protest today, claiming she was illegally removed from her position and that the county's investigation into her activities is part of a personal vendetta against her. I watched as Karen marched up to the cameras, her voice dripping with righteous fury. "I was the heart of this community," she declared. "I dedicated years of my life to making sure our neighborhood was safe, orderly, and respectable. And now, because of one man's vendetta, I've been falsely accused of crimes I didn't commit. Well, I won't be silent. I will fight back." I smirked. She really thought she could spin this into some kind of conspiracy. But then came the best part. As Karen stood there ranting about injustice, 2 police cruisers pulled up behind her. I leaned forward. Oh, this was going to be good. Detective Alvarez stepped out, flanked by 2 uniformed officers. Karen didn't see them at first. She was too busy running her mouth. Then Alvarez raised his voice. "Karen Thompson, you are under arrest for fraud, harassment, attempted real estate theft, and misuse of HOA funds." Karen froze. For the first time since I met her, she was completely speechless. The cameras caught everything. The reporters turned their microphones toward her, eager for a reaction. Karen tried to compose herself. "This is a mistake. This is political persecution. I am the HOA president." Alvarez didn't even blink. "Not anymore. Turn around. Hands behind your back." Karen started to back away. "You can't do this. This is illegal. I'll sue all of you. I'll." One of the officers grabbed her by the arm. She jerked away violently. That was a mistake. Within seconds, the other officer helped restrain her, twisting her arms behind her back and clicking handcuffs around her wrists. The moment they locked in place, cheers erupted. Karen was dragged toward the squad car, still screaming. "You'll regret this. I built this neighborhood. I couldn't help myself," I muttered, "and now you're getting evicted." The news station cut back to the anchors, who looked like they were trying not to laugh. That night, the neighborhood had an impromptu celebration. Patricia popped open a bottle of champagne. Curtis grilled burgers. People laughed, swapped stories, and toasted to finally being free of Karen's reign of terror. By the next week, Karen's house was listed for sale. The county had frozen her bank accounts, and she had no choice but to leave town. As I sat on my porch, sipping my coffee, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Peace. No fake citations. No HOA goons knocking on my door. No Karen. She had underestimated this neighborhood. She thought she could control it. But in the end, all she did was burn herself to the ground. And I had a front row seat to the whole thing. So what about you? Ever dealt with an HOA Karen who thought they ruled the world? Share your stories below, let's see who had it worse.